Nowadays, there is probably not a person alive who has not heard about Mexican drug cartels. Their showdowns are in the news reports of emergencies around the world, and even Netflix shoots series about them. And today, we're going to talk about that period that is so fascinating to filmmakers. The period when the Mexican cartels completed their transition from being smuggling gangs to multi-billionaires. The time when they started making it into Forbes, flying the most expensive private superjets, and buying up the most expensive real estate around the world. We'll travel back to the 1980s and look at how Félix Gallardo, Rafa Quintero, Don Neto, and others created Mexico's biggest drug trafficking ring. We'll see how the US DEA fought it out, battling both in the field with the bargirls and with the US and Mexican bureaucrats. And as always, we'll try to give you the facts that don't lie on the surface. So if you're interested in hearing what were the real events that Netflix showed in the series Narcos Mexico, then meet the Guadalajara cartel on the other side of the law. I will begin my story today about the Guadalajara cartel with a disclaimer. This group isn't really a cartel at all, nor was it called Guadalajara. In a past video on the Mexican Cartels channel discussing the period from the late 19th century to the 1980s, we said that the scientific definition of a cartel is collusion between businesses to control the market and set prices. In relation to Colombian and Mexican drug traffickers, this word has been in use since the 1970s, and such an inaccurate name was conveniently primarily for prosecution. It is easier to prosecute an organization like the Medellin cartel or the Guadalajara cartel than to chase after disparate gangs. A well-known criminal lawyer, Gustavo Salazar, put it accurately: there are no cartels, there are just groups of drug traffickers. Sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. US prosecutors just called them cartels to make it easier to prosecute. In fact, Mexican organizations were in constant flux. Alliances between them were made and broken, but it was in the 80s that a certain system emerged on this disparate map, which is what we will talk about today. Why not Guadalajara? After all, it is under this name this organization is listed in Wikipedia and in the famous TV series. In general, the situation is about the same as with the concept of cartel. The name was invented for convenience by DEA agents at a time when they did not even suspect the scale and volume that provided Gallardo and company. It was later that the world would learn about Sinaloa, Culiacan, and Michoacan. In the 1980s, DEA agents wrote uncomplicatedly in reports about the Guadalajara group, although it would probably be more accurate to say it was the Sinaloa cartel, which, due to certain circumstances, moved to welcoming Guadalajara. Those circumstances we're about to recall. So, in the period from 1976 to 1977, the American and Mexican government conducted an anti-drug operation Condor, which, in their opinion, ended in success. The point of the operation was that the US supplied the Mexicans with agents and equipment to physically destroy marijuana and heroin crops and assisted in the capture of drug traffickers. At the end of 1977, the Drug Enforcement Administration reported that 22,000 acres of poppies had been destroyed, enough to produce 8 tons of heroin. Claims of victory were backed by objective evidence. The purity of Mexican heroin retailing in the United States was at its lowest level in 7 years, but that, of course, was only on paper. The same operation squeezed key bosses of Sinaloa, Mexican's main drug trafficking organization at the time, out of their bases in Guadalajara, and the boss's decision to move to Guadalajara can be viewed from 2 angles. On the one hand, as discussed in the previous video, the reduction of the plantations and the introduction of the army effectively forced the bosses to move out of reach of the US, and Guadalajara was very suitable as a place to lay low. On the other hand, their move especially emphasizes the strong ties between drug traffickers, politicians, and the DFS, Mexico's equivalent of the FBI. According to a Mexican DEA informant and former DFS officer, the idea of moving south was suggested to Sinaloa leaders Félix Gallardo and Don Neto by 2 high-ranking DFS commanders, Esteban Guzman and Daniel Acuna, in a private meeting. According to the informant, the Federales, interested in the success of the common cause, themselves introduced the Sinaloans to influential people in Guadalajara. found them comfortable homes and provided them with bodyguards. Drug traffickers bring money and power. Elaine Shannon wrote in her book Desperados, DFS provided intelligence, coordination, and protection from other government agencies. The Sinaloans were not the only company in the thriving illegal drug market at the time, but they were by far the most important and promising. They controlled the largest marijuana and poppy production areas from Oaxaca to Sonora, passing through Guerrero and Michoacan, plus 2 production strongholds in Durango and Chihuahua. They also operated major border crossings in the states of Baja California, Tijuana, Tecate, Mexicali, and Sonora, San Luis Rio, Colorado, and Nogales, and profited from the contract with the organization of Pablo Acosta, head of the Ojinaga in the state of Chihuahua. Guadalajara became an ideal location for the narcos. As soon as Operation Condor ceased, they began organizing drug operations here, larger than ever before. To maximize profits, they did what all good businessmen do. They went for economies of scale. Instead of buying marijuana from small family farms in the Sierra Madre, they built huge plantations, so huge that they were visible miles away from the sky and required several hundred, if not thousands of people to maintain. Such colossal quantities of marijuana meant colossal amounts of money and an incredible scale of the drug business. As we can see, the most adaptable drug businessmen during Operation Condor not only survived, but thrived thanks to a complex and well-established mechanism that included many links, from huge plantations in the Golden Triangle, the states of Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua, the Fiefdom, and the Sinaloa Cartel, to the system of cash payments to all major politicians and heads of ministries. The mechanism took decades to develop, starting in the 20s of the 20th century, and by the early 80s, it was a single organism in which everyone was connected vertically and horizontally. We talked about the formation in more detail in the first part of the history of the origin of Mexican drug cartels on our channel. Among all the drug traffickers of the late 70s, there was Pedro Aviles, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, Rafael Rafa, Rafa Quintero, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, and a number of other important figures about whom we will now tell you more, because it was they who eventually influenced the current situation to a greater or lesser extent. So it all started in the late 60s when the first hero named Pedro Aviles Perez appeared on the Sinaloan scene, where smuggling gangs competed fiercely. He was born in 1940 and had been involved in the family's illegal business since childhood. Once in power, he smuggled heroin into Southern California and Arizona. Aviles then refocused on the light drug market as it became fashionable, transporting marijuana in 10-ton shipments and introducing now famous innovations into the business, such as airplane transportation and bribing high-ranking officials. Significantly ahead of his time, he made connections in South America and took small quantities of cocaine for sale, which, however, was not his main source of income. Aviles' network stretched from Culiacan to Mexico City and Tijuana. Many of the Sinaloa narcos who became authorities in the 1980s learned the business from Aviles. In particular, Rafael Quintero joined Aviles at the age of 16 and rose to the position of gang capo in Chihuahua. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, was Aviles' treasurer and managed the network's money and investments. Miguel Angel Gallardo, the future bosses of bosses at the beginning of his criminal career, was just a corrupt policeman on Aviles' payroll, and his duties included blackmail and bribery. In parallel with Aviles, a career of another important character for our story is built: Alberto Cecilia Falcon, also called Falcon or Cecilia Falcon. The flamboyant Cuban, who started out as a street hooligan in Miami, made his way to Miami to Mexico City, where he fell in love with a wealthy and powerful woman. This socialite took Alberto under her wing, dressed him up like a playboy, taught him the rules of etiquette, and introduced him to the right people. Later, he acquired a horse ranch and socialized with the elite from Acapulco to Madrid. The Sicilian Falcon organized the first major overland transportation of cocaine from South America via Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Tijuana to Los Angeles. In late 1973, DEA agents in Los Angeles formed a unit called the Central Tactical Unit, also known as CENTAC, to track the tentacles of Falcon's organization from Mexico through the United States to Europe. By 1978, agents had arrested about 400 people connected to the US distribution network. Alberto Falcon was arrested by Mexican police in July 1975. He became the last major drug trafficker to be imprisoned in Mexico for an extended period of time until 1985. But here's the thing, he wasn't Mexican. He was Cuban, in addition to being a known sexual deviant, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, pressured by these facts, literally talked the Mexicans into holding him. Once behind bars, Alberto continued to run his organization from his prison cell, and in 1978, 20 years before the legendary El Chapo, made a similar escape through a dug tunnel, but he was quickly caught and awarded another 20 years. He was released in 1999, having served his entire sentence from start to finish, and nothing has been known about him since. But what is known for sure is the name of the man who ran his extensive business on Falcon's behalf and was based in Guadalajara. This was Manuel Salcido Urzeta, who was nicknamed El Cochiloco, meaning the Mad Pig, because of his cruelty and temper. The Sicilian Falcon did not manage to rule remotely for long. A new leader was rising in Culiacan, and Cochiloco soon joined him. The name of this leader, as you already know, was Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. He was described as a shrewd, reserved, refined, and unusually strict man, and he belonged to a new generation of drug traffickers from Sinaloa. He was born in 1946 in Bella Vista, municipality of Culiacan, Sinaloa, to a family of farmers. His family was not connected to the drug business, unlike the families of Rafa Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo, as we will discuss later. Gallardo's parents worked in the local ejido. We talked about the ejido system in last week's series. These are land parcels for sharing. When Miguel was a kid, he sold chicken and sausage, riding around the neighborhood on his bicycle. He never worked hard physical labor. His sister, interviewed in 1989, said, "We come from a decent, well-mannered family. We're not peasants in sandals. My mother had 9 children and she worked the land to help us in life." Miguel Angel easily completed high school and then enrolled in a local business college. Without graduating, he worked as a traveling salesman for a while, and at the age of 17, in 1963, he became an officer in the Mexican National Police, where he began to get into the subject of drugs, starting to receive a little money from his then boss Pedro Aviles. In the late 1960s, with the active assistance of Aviles, Miguel Angel got a job as a bodyguard for the governor of the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. Despite the fact that the outstanding physical data did not possess, at a height of almost 190 centimeters, he weighed only about 70 kilograms, for which he received the nickname Skinny. It is known that the first warrant for the arrest of Gallardo for drug possession dates back to 1971, and according to the police, then the case did not end up with anything, and with the work of a bodyguard, of course, no one fired him. Miguel became so friendly with the governor that he even became godfather to one of his sons named Rodolfo. In addition to Sanchez Celis, Miguel Angel's friends included Antonio Toledo Coro, who succeeded Celis as governor in 1975. When Aviles Perez was killed in a shootout with the federal police in 1978, Félix Gallardo took over the reins of the organization along with Aviles' former bookkeeper Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, nicknamed Donito, and his childhood friend, one of Aviles' lieutenants, Rafael Caro Quintero. According to the ubiquitous DEA informants, it was Donito who ordered the feds to kill Aviles, but this is more of a rumor after all. Donito was 47 years old at the time, a respected veteran and a kind of second-generation aristocrat of the drug business. Born in Badiraguato in the early 1930s, he was the son of one of the first opium brokers. He was drawn into the business by his maternal uncle, Fidel Carrillo, with whom young Donito was arrested in Tijuana in 1955 in a police special operation. His uncle was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but Neto got off scot-free and learned a lifelong lesson: always pay the cops. By the early 1970s, he was smuggling cocaine from Ecuador through Mexico to the United States, and that's when he earned the nickname for his ability to negotiate. It translated as Mr. Good Price. Under Aviles, Fonseca Carrillo was one of the senior people in the business. In particular, sources report his arrest in Ecuador in 1978 while trying to transport 30 kilograms of cocaine, and most likely this was not the only shipment. The Aviles gang was one of the first in cocaine smuggling, that is, so it was ahead of its competitors. Miguel Angel then only needed to go on and expand the business, listening to the advice of an older comrade. Don Neto had 4 children, but none of them are known within the cartel Guadalajara, but his nephew Amado Carrillo Fuentes, also known as Lord of Heaven, is known. This nickname he received for the method of transportation by airplane, invented by his uncle. A little later, Amado will become the boss of a very important territory for the efficient transportation of goods known as Juarez, and will receive another nickname, Vice President. Another of the Guadalajara bosses is Rafael Caro Quintero, and while Don Neto was a second-generation drug aristocrat, Caro Quintero was a third-generation Sinaloan drug prince. His age remains a mystery to this day. Rafa was born according to various reports where between 1952 and 1956. He had more connections than Fonseca Carrillo and Félix Gallardo. In fact, few members of his family were not involved in the trade. For one thing, they were blood relatives. His father was a drug trafficker, his paternal aunt, Manuela Caro, was a prominent heroin expert, his maternal uncle, Lamberto Quintero, was a famous 1970s drug dealer. His siblings, Miguel and Hector, were also in the business. But in Rafa's childhood, being a drug dealer didn't mean being fabulously rich, so he, the eldest of 12 children, only finished a couple of grades of school and had to work, and as a teenager, he ended up in Avila's gang, where he quickly moved up the ranks. Caro Quintero's stake was in pot. In 1971, he was arrested while transporting pot to Avila's warehouses in San Luis Rio, Colorado. After getting out of jail, he moved to the town of Caboca on the Sonora coast, where he bought over 80 acres of land and experimented with marijuana varieties. It was Rafa and his brothers who would become the king of Sinsemilla, which by the early 1980s would begin to bring in a lot of money. Sinsemilla, whose name translates to seedless, is a special way of growing 2-meter tall female bushes whose buds contain the highest concentration of THC. It is a costly and complex agronomic process for which the Guadalajara cartel had the resources and capacity, and Rafael Caro Quintero was a true professor of Sinsemilla cultivation. Also, a story about the personalities of the Guadalajara cartel would be incomplete without mentioning a truly legendary boss by the name of Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known as El Chapo. Although his name will be rumbled later in the 90s, we will still tell about him because at least in the series Narco Mexico shows a completely delusional version of his appearance in Guadalajara, and now you will understand why. Joaquin Arquivaldo Guzman Loera was born in a tiny village near Badiraguato on April 4, 1957. The entire Chapo family was employed on an opium poppy plantation and received good money per kilogram of raw material. As you remember from the last video, it was very problematic for an ordinary peasant to sell what was grown. But if that peasant, like El Chapo's father, was a distant relative of Pedro Aviles Perez, there was no problem. So by the age of 20, Chapo was already experienced in business matters and had earned a reputation for being indispensable when delicate problems needed to be settled. In a few years of hard work, he went from being a penniless relative of Aviles to one of Gallardo's cronies. Now El Chapo learned all the skills of business from Gallardo, and it must be said that he was very successful, but we will tell more about it in the future video about El Chapo himself. In addition to the above characters, the Sinaloa organization included several other people with big names: Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Arturo Beltran Leiva, and the Arellano Felix brothers Benjamin, Ramon, Francisco, Javier, and Eduardo. On the border of Ojinaga, the legendary Pablo Acosta reigned supreme. In addition, there were other leaders such as Hector El Guerrero Palma Salazar, Juan Jose Esparagoza, El Azul, Jaime Herrera, brothers Pedro and Oscar Lupercio Serratos, Rogaciano Alba Alvarez, and the Diaz Parada family. All of these people and their families were responsible for strategic locations in the business and were loyal to the Sinaloans. As you will remember from the first video, family ties provided the right level of trust for the operation of illegal markets because they greatly reduced the possibility of betrayal. As an example, Arturo Beltran was married to Chapo Guzman's cousin. It was because of trust that by the early 1980s, the Mexicans were able to create such a powerful drug distribution network. But as we said above, the organization's bosses had to move to Guadalajara in 1978 when government troops arrived in Sinaloa. In a way, Operation Condor did the Sinaloans a great favor by weeding out the competition. The Americans' goal in the operation was to reduce opium poppy crops, and a little later, the focus shifted to marijuana. At first, the fields were sprayed with pesticide that had no effect on the grass crops, but destroyed the poppies. The share of Mexican diluted tar, as Mexican heroin was called, fell to 30%, and the drug market was flooded with a flow of pure white goods from Afghanistan, which had just a good year. Then the Americans started destroying marijuana using a poison called paraquat, which had unexpected consequences. Farmers continued to harvest the poisoned crops, dry them, and send them to their insatiable northern neighbors. By conservative estimates, 1/5 of all Mexican weed shipped was poisoned with this highly toxic substance that was fatal to consumers. Congress decided to stop the spraying, and addicts switched to supplies from Colombia. And here we have to turn away from Mexican passions to understand a few very important facts about Colombia, because what happened there had a direct impact on the events we are describing. Number 1, by 1978, almost 3/4 of the US market was pot imported from Colombia. Marijuana cultivation had spread inland and was generating $1 billion a year. The country was in political chaos after a 20-year massacre between political factions, allowing the bargainers to set up their own distribution networks. In October 1978, Colombia's new president, Turbay, declared that the drug economy was a threat to the national security of the state, and until March 1980 tried to fight it, but without success. And in the time it took to fight the cultivation and transportation of marijuana, which was already going out of fashion, a powerful new organization was being set up in an as yet unknown city called Medellin, with an eye on the cocaine trade. And this is the second important fact. In the early 1970s, Cuban traffickers in Miami controlled a relatively small wholesale cocaine market in the United States. Their customers were mostly other Cuban immigrants until Colombians came into the business and organized what will go down in history as the Cocaine Cowboy War. The newly minted Colombian dealers had one big advantage over the Cubans. Thanks to marijuana, the Medellin gangs had access to a vast network of middle-class distributors all along the US East Coast. Drug Enforcement Administration agents later concluded that the very temporary destruction of the Mexican marijuana industry due to Operation Condor was the direct cause of the birth of the Colombian cocaine industry. While US agencies were engaged in bureaucratic battles over how to stop the carnage on the streets of Miami, Medellin's cocaine networks had grown so large that the cocaine cowboys seemed like mere children. By 1982, DEA agents learned that the Medellin drug dealers had formed a cartel, and 4 men were behind it: Jorge Ochoa, Pablo Escobar, Carlos Lida, and Jose Rodriguez Gacha. They controlled 80% of the cocaine produced in Colombia by then. The Medellin cocaine cartel was the richest and most dangerous criminal gang on earth, and would have continued to grow vertically and horizontally, but on June 24, 1982, President Reagan defeated the bureaucracy a little and ordered a renewed war on drugs. Hundreds of FBI and DEA agents rushed to Florida, the main distribution point for the Colombian product and the so-called Caribbean drug transportation route, which had been the main route for Medellin, began to collapse. But as we know, according to the law of the balloon, the air in it will move to another part if you squeeze harder in one part. As the Colombians felt the pressure from the United States and the percentage of seized shipments increased, they began looking for new ways to get cocaine into North America. And you don't have to know a lot about geography to realize that the most obvious route was through Central America and Mexico. Compared to the Mexicans, the Colombians were probably newcomers in the transportation of the product. All that remained was to establish contacts and conclude an agreement on mutually beneficial terms between the drug businessmen of both countries. The key figure here was Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, a Honduran born in Tegucigalpa in 1945, would become the largest employer in his country and one of the protagonists of the golden age of cocaine. In 1961, at the age of 16, Mata emigrated to New York in search of the American dream, where he worked as a cashier in a supermarket. He later married a Colombian woman and then went to prison, which, as usual, is a place to make useful connections. Well, he eventually escaped from there and started working with cocaine. One of his drug distribution contacts was our old acquaintance, Alberto Cecilia Falcon, who was just starting to supply Colombian cocaine. After establishing trade networks, Ballesteros decided it was safer to operate from Honduras and moved to his native Tegucigalpa, and it was there that Colombians from the Medellin cartel tracked him down, asking him to help with transportation issues through Mexico. For Mata Ballesteros, who personally knew Rafael Quintero and Miguel Félix Gallardo, it was not difficult. In addition, such mediation was an opportunity to expand his business. After all, he was becoming not only a member of the Medellin cartel, but also a member of the Guadalajara cartel. And this is where our story really begins. Having made contact with Quintero and Félix Gallardo through Ballesteros, the Colombians began negotiations. According to DEA Regional Director Jay Bergman, it looked something like this. The tough Colombians came to the Mexicans and said, "We Colombians own the product and we can distribute it ourselves in the United States. You Mexicans only have marijuana and heroin. We suggest you make an agreement. We bring our product to your territory, you bring it across the border and give it to our people." On the part of the newborn Guadalajara cartel, it would have been foolish not to agree, and so began a business relationship between two of the largest criminal gangs of their time. The result of this agreement was a radical change in the composition, structure, and profitability of Mexican organized crime. As you remember from the first video, the Mexican drug business went through several phases related to the substance use booms in the United States. The first was the demand for opium during World War II and in the 1950s, followed by the marijuana boom in the 60s and 70s, and a third upsurge began just in the 80s with the arrival of cocaine. Within a few years, in the early 80s, by about 1984, cocaine had become the main source of income for Mexican drug businessmen. Being directly involved in this new market was the solution to all their problems, as marijuana export revenues were declining and heroin exports, while still stable, were not making much money. They were no longer in vogue. Thus, turning the Colombian cartels into a parcel delivery service to serve the 6 million cocaine addicts in the US not only compensated for the decline in revenues, but also made the business more profitable. As profits grew, so did their influence in all spheres. Criminals complicated their organizational structure in various ways, including the emergence of paramilitary forces to protect business interests, as well as the bribery of high-level officials, because operations involving the transportation of huge amounts of cocaine required more and more state protection and the involvement of all levels of government, from local police to deputies. The state and the drug business worked as a single mechanism, the gears of which were lubricated with the best oil, cocaine millions. Terrence Pop, Pablo Acosta's interviewer, recounted one very vivid episode related to the process of the cocaine business being integrated into the Mexican logistical system. Ojinaga, Chihuahua was an important border transportation point in which Pablo Acosta, a Sinaloan loyalist, was the undisputed leader. When the Colombians contacted Guadalajara leaders, Don Neto, an old acquaintance of Acosta's, sent his nephew Amado Carrillo Fuentes to Ojinaga as a guarantor for the purity of the deal. As early as the end of 1984, the first direct flights from Colombia to Ojinaga on long-range twin-turbine airplanes were recorded. Acosta was responsible for ensuring that the shipments were protected through liaison with the army so that the authorities would not seize them and would assist in transportation. A small portion of the cocaine was destined for Acosta and the rest for other organizations that transported it through British Columbia, Sonora, and Tamaulipas. They paid Pablo Acosta between $1,000 and $1,500 per kilogram for use of space, storage, and transportation services, and he provided top-shelf service, which is known in detail from the DEA informant. Thus, the informant gave information about the arrival of a plane carrying 816 kilograms of cocaine at Ojinaga in May 1985. The plane landed on a ranch 50 kilometers south of Ojinaga. The cocaine was packaged in bricks of 1 kilogram each, round or rectangular in shape, which according to a witness looked like cheese wafers. The shipment was lowered and transported into an underground cylindrical metal cistern about a meter underground near the landing strip. After the cocaine was placed in the tank, the hole was covered with earth and no one from the outside would have guessed the existence of such a drug deposit. A 1,500-liter tanker truck would arrive and fill the plane with jet fuel, and it would return to Colombia. A few days later, the goods would be transported from the ranch to a warehouse on the outskirts of Ojinaga in 2 pickup trucks guarded by the army. At the end of the maneuver, Acosta, as was his custom, gave $20 to each soldier of the Ojinaga garrison involved in escorting the goods. The cargo was then divided into 7 pieces and stashed in the propane tanks of the trucks that had already delivered them to the United States via the Loma de Arena intersection. Reports later emerged of direct meetings in Colombia between Pablo Acosta and Carlos Leder, in which they organized ever larger shipments of cocaine through Ojinaga. The DEA informant claimed that between 1985 and 1986, Pablo Acosta imported 5 tons of cocaine per month into the United States. If the fee for each kilogram transported to the United States was $1,250, then a simple calculation reveals that Pablo Acosta received $6,250,000 a month, or $75 million a year, just for the Colombians' use of his infrastructure. That's a very lucrative courier service. And that's just the one and only gateway into the US through which the Guadalajara cartel operated. Through Tijuana, Tecate, Mexicali, San Luis Rio Colorado, Nogales, and Ciudad Juarez, according to the DEA's best estimates, several times more goods passed through Tijuana than Pablo Acosta shipped through Ojinaga. It's also important to note the relationship between Colombians and Mexicans. Diego Osorno, for his book on the history of the Sinaloa cartel, interviewed the lawyer Miguel Félix Gallardo. The lawyer assured that the leaders of the 2 largest gangs, Gallardo and Escobar, had developed not only a business relationship but also a friendship. Were they just business partners? No, they were still friends, very good friends. Escobar was a pro in his field and Miguel had a lot of influence in his. And Escobar, of course, was good at framing Americans, but Miguel did it better. The lawyer also reported that they saw each other several times in both Colombia and Mexico. What can we summarize from these words? The trust born of friendship and mutual sympathy between the 2 bosses reduced the risk of breach of contract and therefore also reduced the need for preventative and punitive measures in case of unclear situations. Friendship strengthened the business relationship. In addition to friendship, there was also mutual respect for the power that each possessed within their territories, which is why no open clashes between Mexicans and Colombians were recorded during the entire time, which shows one thing: a reliable and effective partnership was established between them. Thus, the back door in Mexico actually proved far more convenient and productive than the front door in Florida, and Mexican drug traffickers were more than satisfied. But clearly, Gallardo had an advantage over Escobar not only in terms of logistics, but also in terms of distribution in the United States. Over time, the relationship between the Colombians and the Mexicans gradually expanded and the terms of the original arrangements changed in Guadalajara's favor, as will be seen later. The Colombians usually paid cash for each load cargo. The first cargoes were paid in pesos. Later they were paid in dollars. But after a while, Gallardo sensed that money could depreciate and it was more convenient to deal directly with the goods. Distributing it directly to the North American market was a gamble. So when the Colombian cartel began to deliver more cargo, he demanded payment in goods. Escobar agreed. He even found it convenient. The terms were as follows. If the cargo was easy to transport and hide in a train or truck, 35% of the cocaine went to the Mexicans. If it was more complicated and had to use, for example, underground tunnels, they got 50% of the shipment. By about the end of 1984, the Mexicans had become not only transporters, but also distributors. This is often the case in a legitimate business. The distributor becomes the manufacturer's most important competitor, and the subsidiaries' profit exceed those of the parent company. Gallardo was well aware that as profits increased, he and his associates would become more visible. He realized that he needed to keep a low profile, especially at a time when all the public attention was focused on Escobar and Colombia. And, it must be said, he was able to do that for a while. He's led a modest life, more like a manager than an emperor. He kept a close eye on deliveries because he knew that everything had to go right, that payment must be made at every roadblock. Every officer in charge of a certain neighborhood, every mayor of every village you had to pass through. Gallardo understood that you have to pay. Pay to make your luck be seen as universal. Pay before someone talks. betrays, blabs, or offers more before you're turned over to a hostile group or the police. The source of the drug traffickers' powers was not intelligence but money, tens of billions of dollars, sums that 10 years ago were unthinkable. Money bought weapons, safe haven, and finally the ability to command provincial and even central governments. No criminal enterprise had ever had the kind of money available to drug traffickers in Latin America and North America, and where it came from, there was much more. Streams of dollars were pouring in from the United States, whose population seemed to have an insatiable appetite for cocaine and marijuana. DEA agents based in Guadalajara knew very little about Gallardo's current operations, although the agency had known about him since 1975. By 1979, Gallardo was listed in Drug Enforcement Administration files as a middleman specializing in small cocaine shipments to Arizona from Los Angeles. The US government was more interested in criminals who crossed the border and were actually apprehended, as shipments were regularly intercepted. The newspapers constantly covered the fight against drug traffickers. 200 kilos in Miami, 100 kilos in Arizona, but the flow didn't stop. The whole picture did not emerge, for the US-Mexican territory remained a patchwork of small networks. Moreover, in 1982, the Mexicans had banned US reconnaissance flights over their territory. In addition, they had no diplomatic immunity. The Mexican government granted diplomatic status only to DEA agents in Mexico City, but refused to grant similar privileges to agents in local offices. Since the 1920s, there had been an unwritten agreement between the DEA and top central government officials that DEA agents could carry personal firearms, but when they did so, they were violating Mexican law and therefore at the mercy of local officials, so they couldn't get guns either. Ronald Reagan, upon assuming his presidency, declared at his first press conference in 1981 that he would not be at war with the drug trade but would take customers away from drug dealers. But his domestic anti-drug program didn't do much good, and neither did his foreign program. The fight against Latin drug lords was inevitably intertwined with politics and diplomacy. First, Latin American countries owed billions of dollars to US creditors, and the open fight against NARCO'S posed a direct threat to transnational corporations, big banks, and their representatives in the Treasury Department. Second, Reagan himself was obsessed with Soviet and Cuban activism. More important than all the drug lords was the suppression of leftist guerrilla movements in Central and South America. They were particularly determined to maintain American influence in two strategic important Latin American countries, despite evidence that the governments were repressive and riddled with corruption. Panama, home to the strategically important Panama Canal, and a base for 10,000 US troops, and Mexico, the third largest US trading partner and the largest source of imported oil. Reagan zealously pursued the narcotics issue in only one instance, when leftist guerrillas or Marxist governments were believed to be trading drugs for arms. But when DEA agents found evidence of corruption in non-communist countries willing to cooperate in resisting Cuban and Soviet intervention, Reagan showed truly angelic tolerance and offered to look for ways to improve cooperation. The 6 agents in the DEA's Guadalajara office were not particularly happy about the home country policy and the ever-deteriorating work conditions. The US government's line was unequivocal. Mexico's campaign against drugs was a model program. Relations between the DEA and the Mexican police were excellent. The situation was under control. Indeed, nothing was under control. Gallardo, for example, was a respected man in the community, a hotelier who regularly appeared in the press on various occasions, whether it was sponsoring a university or being best man at a wedding of his godson, the governor's son. Rafa Quintero owned a garage of luxury cars the size of a decent house, which in Guadalajara did not know only a blind deaf mute, and was actually the shadow governor of the town Caboca. At the same time, the Guadalajara DEA office consisted of at best 7 agents: James Kirkendall, Pete Hernandez, Butch Sears, Roger Knapp, Victor Wallace, Victor Cortez, and Enrique Caramina, whose purview was limited to surveillance work. They all arrived in the early 1980s and began to observe. In 1982, Félix Gallardo's cocaine organization became the focus of an intelligence project led by Butch Sears. The project, dubbed Operation Padrino, baffled everyone in the office. The flowchart on the corkboard looked like a spider's web. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that Félix Gallardo was not only the largest cocaine trafficker in Mexico, but generally one of the largest drug traffickers in the Western Hemisphere. His organization had grown to the point where he was shipping 1.5 to 2 tons of cocaine a month, making him as powerful as the drug traffickers of Medellin. A startling fact was beginning to dawn on them. Although more DEA agents were based in Mexico than in any other foreign country, not a single member of the new generation of narco had ever been indicted in the United States. If Rafa Quintero or Félix Gallardo showed up at DEA headquarters, the American agents would have no choice but to buy them a beer. Condor, the chief of staff, told his agents he wanted them to learn everything they could about the cartel leaders and their silent partners in the political and economic establishment. It went against the requirements of their headquarters, but he didn't care. Among all the few agents, Enrique Camarena, nicknamed Kiki, particularly stood out. Enrique Camarena Salazar was born on July 26, 1946 in Mexicali, Mexico. His parents then moved to the United States, where Kiki graduated from high school in Calexico, California in 1966 and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1968. After 2 years of distinguished service in the Marine Corps, Kiki had time to work as a firefighter, police officer, and country deputy sheriff in his hometown. Kiki joined the Drug Enforcement Administration in June 1974. In 1977, after 3 years in Calexico, he was transferred to Fresno County office in Northern California, and 4 years later, Kiki was ordered to Guadalajara. By 1980, the time of his assignment to Guadalajara was an experienced undercover agent who made more than one arrest, had a wife, Mika, and 2 children, and he couldn't even imagine what was going on in Mexico because his job in America was mostly tracking down small-time dealers and sometimes confiscating drug shipments. Yes, the work was dangerous, nerve-wracking, but still the scale was completely different. In Guadalajara, Kiki plunged headlong into his projects, concentrating on Rafael Quintero. Rafa, unlike Gallardo and Neto, led an open lifestyle. Of all 3 Guadalajara bosses, he was the only one who was popular with the people and was not shy about driving around the city in his cool cars. Quintero and Neto, by the way, were in the marijuana business, not the cocaine business, according to informants. In May 1982, one of Caramena's informants told an outlandish story. Marijuana was growing on 220 acres in the state of San Luis Potosi, about 200 miles northeast of Guadalajara. The agents were skeptical. The plantation the man described would have been visible from anywhere, for it was in the middle of the vast central Mexican desert. The informant insisted that the plantation existed and that the grass on it was irrigated by a clever modern system of underground wells. The marijuana stalks, he said, were already sprouting 1.5 meters high. The plantation, he said, belonged to Rafa, Neto, and El Azul. The agents realized that if the informant's words were confirmed, it would completely discredit the Mexican eradication campaign, according to the reports of which there were no giant fields since Operation Condor in Mexico. The fact is that in 1982, the Mexican Attorney General's office in charge of crop eradication divided the country into zones. Airplanes provided by the US government were to fly over these zones at regular intervals. Although it was difficult to spot a marijuana field on the wooded western slopes of the Sierra Madre or in the jungles of Veracruz and Oaxaca, the field that side in the desert would stand out like a green neon square at any time of day. It turned out that Rafa Neto, El Azul's group, had planted 1/3 of a square mile in the San Luis desert and absolutely no one had noticed. This meant one of 2 things. Either the Mexican decision-makers knew about it but didn't tell, or that they didn't know about it because they hadn't done the reconnaissance. In the first case, it is likely that the officers were simply bribed. In the second case, they were moving American money and airplanes out under false pretenses and for unclear purposes. Either way, it was a slap in the face to Uncle Sam, and it meant someone was making a lot of money. The marijuana sites in the Sierra Madre were making a modest profit because of the rather high costs of transportation and handling. Marijuana is a fairly difficult substance to transport. Unlike cocaine or heroin, it has a strong odor and cannot be compressed into logistically convenient kilogram bricks like cocaine. Small amounts of weed for sale take up a lot of space, and the only way to get rich off marijuana is to grow and sell the commodity on a large scale, as the Colombians did. That was hard to achieve in the rugged Sierra Madre, but if the flat, arid central highlands of Mexico were turned into an agribusiness with intensive irrigation and tons of fertilizer, as they did in the central valleys of California, the potential profits would be huge. The easiest way to find out what was going on was to fly over the place, but DEA agents needed an official escort to do that, and they weren't prepared to tell the Mexican federales what they knew. Kiki began looking for more informants. According to the Camarena case file, they said that a federal commandant was guarding the plantation and delivering weapons there. They revealed that El Azul's aide had given the army lieutenant a new Ford pickup truck. The DEA agents became more and more convinced that the information about the giant plantation was not fiction. The more we learned, the more we were amazed at what was happening, Kirkendall later recounted. Kirkendall tried to influence State Department officials in Mexico City with the significance of the plantation. In August 1982, he went to a meeting of embassy officials and presented evidence collected by Camarena. The diplomats ignored Kirkendall because there simply could not have been such a plantation, as confirmed by the Mexicans. It was a catch-22 situation. Camarena had no evidence because he could not have flown over the area. He could not have flown over the area because he had no evidence. The Mexican Attorney General's office would not send a DEA agent into the area without a request from the embassy. The embassy didn't want to bring it up without hard evidence. Camarena went back to work. He obtained a photograph of the area and enough details to convince the embassy that plantations existed. In early September 1982, Camarena's testimony was presented to the Mexican Attorney General's office. It was so convincing that Mexican authorities ordered a search and destroy operation. In early September, 7 helicopters took to the air with a group of soldiers and agents from Mexico's Federal Judicial Police. On board were Camarena and Kirkendall. Despite what they heard, the Drug Enforcement Administration agents were stunned when the helicopters broke through the cloud cover and an emerald marijuana plantation came into view. The raid set a record. 200 tons of high-grade Sinsemilla marijuana had been harvested. The plantation was cultivated with the latest agricultural technology. The fields were irrigated by 3 deep wells and 20 tons of chemical fertilizers were stored in a barn. Nearby were barracks with bunks for 100 men and fresh food in the kitchen, but there was not a living soul within a radius of several miles. According to Camarena's informants, a police officer with knowledge of the action reported it shortly before the raid, giving the workers time to escape. The San Luis Potosi Community Ministry gave Camarena evasive answers when he tried to obtain documents regarding ownership of the field. Camarena gave the feds information he had gotten from informants about alleged owner Antonio Perez Parga, but Perez was ultimately never arrested. And it was there, in the field among sturdy marijuana bushes of the most expensive variety of marijuana tall as a man, that the agents realized that only the fight against corruption will solve the problem of drug trafficking. And at the highest levels, the Federal Judicial Police, the Army, the government officials at many different levels were all in on the case. But they ran up against the bureaucracy of the US State Department as well as their own superiors. Senior DEA officials at the embassy doubted that the discovery was of such great significance. They claimed it was a shot in the dark, Kirkendall recounted. And it's a unique case, there's nowhere else like it. I mean, we made sure it was everywhere. A few weeks later, news reached Camarena of a second large plantation owned by Rafael Quintero in the state of Sonora. Kirkendall relayed the information to the DEA office in Mexico City, which in turn convinced Mexico's federal police headquarters and the army to send a raiding party. Roger Knapp, who had recently joined the DEA group, traveled to Culiacan to join the feds in the raid. The fields were exactly where the informant had indicated, 170 acres of marijuana swaying in the wind in the open air. Knapp and the Federals traveled to Ciudad Obregón and spent the night, intending to begin the sweep at dawn. Rising at 6 o'clock in the morning, they found the FSPM commander from Culiacan waiting for them. This commander, who was said to be a close friend of El Azul, was deliberately excluded from the raid. Apparently, he learned of the raid at night because he arrived through the mountains in Sonora just in time for morning. The command for a postponement was issued. After waiting all day, Knapp decided the situation was hopeless and headed back to Guadalajara. An informant later told him that the feds had confiscated some of the marijuana, but allowed him to harvest other fields the same day. Guadalajara's DEA agents understood the scale of the Mexican osprey, and they also understood why it was happening. The high-level government was giving the drug businessmen tacit approval for many maneuvers, a true social contract in which everyone understood each other at a glance. But the government still represented the interests of the state, not those of the drug dealers, which meant that it could still be persuaded or pressured to take drastic measures. And that kind of persuasion had to be done by the President of the United States, the top officials of his administration, and Congress. And it certainly couldn't have been done by a couple dozen agents who weren't even authorized to be arrested overseas and carry weapons. In early 1983, Condor went to a meeting of Drug Enforcement Administration officials in San Antonio, armed with a stack of photographs showing Camarena posing in fields of 1.5 foot tall sinsemilla bushes. When asked to explain what they were, he replied, "Corruption." The photos had no wow effect on anyone, and he simply drove back to Guadalajara. The DEA agents continued their usual routine of gathering information on their own as best as they could, and only at the last minute did they contact the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. There were some brave local cops who were not averse to making arrests, but that was only if two factors coincided. They had to be found and properly negotiated, and the superior officer did not have to be on the payroll of the bargainer he was being asked about. Basically, information on every move the DEA agents made was instantly available to the cartel. Camarena spent a lot of time at the Federal Judicial Police office trying to gather a little bit of useful information. For a while, he even thought he had a couple of buddies until he learned that these were the men on the payroll of Rafa Quintero and Neto. Eventually, the Guadalajara office staff concluded that the Federal Judicial Police was such an untrustworthy authority that they stopped sharing confidential information with them, even with those employees who seemed eager to help. DEA agents could never be sure that the people they thought were their allies were not playing a double game. Neither DEA headquarters nor the U.S. Attorney's Office along the border showed any interest in charging Rafa Quintero, Félix Gallardo, and the other bosses. Federal prosecutors did not want to waste time and energy developing conspiracy charges against foreigners who rarely traveled to the United States. The many local DEA officers tended to focus on smugglers and distributors who operated on the US side, where evidence was easier to obtain. The only cartel member who had been indicted by then was Neto, and that case was prosecuted by customs agents in San Diego, but it stalled because of interagency squabbles between the DA's office, the DEA, and customs. The investigation began in December 1982 when customs agents working on a money laundering case were tipped off about a group of Mexicans who were smuggling large sums of cash from San Diego to Tijuana. The trail led to a house in Rancho Santa Fe, an exclusive suburb perched high on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Neto and Rafa's relatives lived in the house. They used a paging service and pagers to control the delivery of large shipments of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine to Los Angeles and to transfer millions of dollars back to Mexico. Customs officials asked the U.S. Attorney's Office to apply for a court order to wiretap the house. The local DEA office agreed, but mid-level managers at DEA headquarters objected on the grounds that customs agents were supposed to be involved in anti-smuggling investigations and had no jurisdiction to administer the wiretap under the nation's drug trafficking laws. After a month of bureaucratic battles, permission to wiretap was granted, but on January 28, 1983, Neto left town. When customs officials arrived at the house, they found clothes in the closet and food on the table. By mid-1983, Kiki Camarena was convinced that Rafa Quintero was making huge plantations of elite and lucrative sinsemilla throughout the Central Highlands. He was eager to fly around the Sierra Madre on his own terms and came up with a plan: charter an airplane, hire a pilot, and conduct his own aerial reconnaissance without Mexican government pilots. It was a radical idea, and Camarena knew it. He called his plan Operation Milagro, meaning Operation Miracle, because, as he told Condor, with a sad smile, it would be a miracle if anyone approved it. Over the next few months, in meetings with DEA leadership in Mexico City, Condor promoted the idea of DEA aerial monitoring. He insisted that the State Department had purposefully underestimated marijuana production to account for the sensitivity of the diplomatic situation with Mexico. Tensions between Mexico City and the Guadalajara office became particularly acute after Ed Heath, who was completely out of touch with the situation, was appointed DEA attaché in Mexico City in mid-1983. Moreover, according to Condor, Ed Heath had the worst version of sycophancy imaginable. Heath allegedly befriended officials at the Mexican Attorney General's office and headquarters of the Federal Judicial Police, particularly its director, Manuel Ibarra. His unhurried and caring approach to his flashy Mexican counterparts satisfied many U.S. Embassy political officials but led to clashes with field agents. Diplomacy has always been the art of compromise, but most DEA field agents saw compromise as a slippery slope because they understood how the system worked and what greased its gears. Looking ahead, Ed Heath's new friend Manuel Ibarra would go on trial in 1990 in the U.S. murder trial of Kiki Camarena, so the issues of antagonism between center and field were not matters of personal attitude. They were literally matters of life and death for agents not protected, unlike Ed Heath, by diplomatic immunity. Thus, in the summer of 1983, after Camarena and Sears had spent months identifying members of the Rafa Quintero network in Guadalajara, Heath ordered Condor to send the names and addresses he had obtained. Heath assured that he would personally arrange for a reliable task force of federales from Mexico City to come to Guadalajara for the searches. Condor didn't like the idea, but he had no choice. It was a direct order. So the untainted feds arrived in Guadalajara and checked into the De las Americas motel, which belonged to who? Yeah, that's right, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. By the time they had started searching, all the addresses were empty. Camarena and his partners spent months trying to find new addresses and phone numbers of gang members. In May 1983, Agent Pete Hernandez turned himself in, asking to be transferred back to Texas. He told his comrades in the Guadalajara office that he wanted to put someone in jail who would stay there to sit. He was tired of being bullied by the Mexican feds. A few months later, Butch Sears learned there was a job opening in Bolivia and applied. He said he thought Bolivia might be corrupt and backward, but at least the American embassy staff and the DEA agents were on the same page. He was referring to his unsuccessful attempts to reach the government to demand access to Gallardo's bank statements, which could shed light on the inner workings of the cocaine trafficking organization. Camarena, Hernandez, and Knapp were able to get informants into the Rafa Quintero operation with relative ease, but this was only because the marijuana trade required thousands of growers, overseers, engineers, truck drivers, and security guards. This branch of the Guadalajara cartel's business was prominent, just as Rafa himself was prominent. But they never even came close to Félix Gallardo's business. Trafficking in finished cocaine was capital intensive, but not labor intensive at all. A man like El Padrino, as Gallardo was also known, needed only a small group of trusted associates to run his business, but he had to be able to transfer millions of dollars to many countries to pay for cocaine, airplanes, trucks, and bribes. Sears believed that the best way to get into the cocaine business was to analyze the financial transactions. Thus, as early 1982, during his Operation Padrino, Sears suspected that Félix Gallardo had acquired a stake in a Guadalajara bank to launder money. He requested the Mexican government for the drug businessman's bank details, but was flatly declined. Later that year, DEA agents in Lima came across a cashier's check from Bank of America in San Diego. The agents were surprised to find that Félix Gallardo's organization had transferred $20 million through a single account at Bank of America in 1 month. At that rate, agents calculated the gang could be making $200 million a year or even more, given that major drug operations had scattered their assets among many banks. While the agents were concocting their schemes, the proceeds from cocaine sales on the West Coast were collected and trucked to Guadalajara, deposited in Félix Gallardo's bank there, and transferred back to Bank of America in San Diego. Félix Gallardo's money agent, Thomas Valles Corral, would withdraw the money in the form of cashier's checks in denominations of $40,000 or $50,000 and sent them to South America to be paid to cocaine producers. The cancelled checks became invaluable information to the DEA. They now knew where Gallardo was getting his cocaine from. Some checks were cashed in little-known towns in the jungles of Colombia, some on the Peru-Bolivia border. 4 $200,000 checks ended up in Switzerland with Roberto Suarez Jr. of a prominent Bolivian cocaine family. Sears and Kelly took copies of the cancelled checks to Mexico City to show them to bank regulators and Mexican customs officials. They again requested access to Mexican bank records that they believed might reveal information about Félix Gallardo's partners and investments. Again, the request was denied. Sears had hoped that someone at the embassy would raise the issue in high-level meetings, but all remained silent. And yet, he was so close to the truth. True, his estimate of $20 million a year was far from reality. It's hard to believe, but by 1985, Mexican narcotics revenues from cocaine, sinsemilla, and opium were generating between $2 and $6 billion a year, and the innovation of bank intermediation was not the last reason for this level of profit. In fact, banks played a crucial role in the international expansion of Mexican trade. This was a major technological change. It was as important as learning how to grow sinsemilla or prepare high-quality heroin. Banks allowed the narco to transfer money quickly and efficiently between countries. Gone were the agonizing days of carrying suitcases full of cash and waiting in bars and hotels for tense transfers. Agent Sears' mood briefly improved when an informant gave him the radio frequencies that Félix Gallardo's communications network used to control airplane and truck traffic. The Drug Enforcement Administration in Guadalajara asked the CIA station in Mexico City to help set up a system to monitor radio traffic, but there was no response. So the agents bought equipment with their own money from a Radio Shack store in the United States and put together their own monitoring system. Sears said it was the last straw and flew to Bolivia. Shortly before Easter 1984, Agent Knapp, who had stepped into Sears' shoes, received a report that a large shipment of cocaine was coming into Guadalajara. Félix Gallardo was to appear there in person. Fed headquarters in Mexico City agreed to send another reliable team of agents. Encouraged, Knapp waited for the feds to catch Gallardo red-handed. But as you can imagine, the delivery never arrived and Félix Gallardo never showed up. Meanwhile, things were still going well in the United States. Congressmen and journalists had never heard of Félix Gallardo's expanding cocaine empire or the giant marijuana plantations that Rafa and Don Neto were financing. The Reagan administration was silent. On June 22, 1983, Dominic DiCarlo, Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Narcotics Affairs, gave a rousing speech about Mexico's marijuana and opium eradication program. DiCarlo said the Mexican program has been so successful that growers have responded by planting tiny fields that were more isolated and difficult to access. There was nothing tiny or hard to find in the marijuana fields that Camarena and his partners found in the desert, but DiCarlo didn't mention these large open plantations at all. The position of the State Department's Narcotics Assistance Division in Mexico City was that the desert fields were an aberration. Their priority was opium, and in Sinaloa, a region where poppy and marijuana cultivation was very difficult because of the topography and risk of aerial surveillance. Meanwhile, DEA agents in Guadalajara learned of another large plantation in the desert, 200 acres of sinsemilla in Zacatecas. They alerted the feds, who sent a report with photographs of the complete destruction of the crops. 2 informants later told DEA agents that the marijuana had actually been carefully harvested and packed by Mexican army soldiers. And so, while US agencies were solving problems on the South American continent, while they were passing the buck to each other and fighting the Cold War with the communists, by January 1984, marijuana seizures along the southwest border had increased 5-fold since 1980. If anyone wasted no time, it was the Guadalajara cartel's enterprising drug businessmen, nearly eradicated by Mexican government reports. The borders were woefully short of customs agents, much less DEA agents. Requests to the center to beef up the border were never answered. A couple of months later, the Tucson office made its largest seizure in 10 years, 2 truckloads of marijuana totaling nearly a ton. Around the same time, in early 1984, Kiki Camarena's investigation saw a breakthrough. an informant reported that drug lords from Guadalajara had formed a syndicate to finance thousands of acres of sinsemilla marijuana plantations in Zacatecas, Durango, and Chihuahua. The list literally represented the top 30 in the Mexican drug industry: Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Juan Esparragosa, and 21 other names, each of which Kiki knew. Camarena began to dig further. In violation of an agreement between the United States and Mexico that prohibited airspace surveillance by US agents, Camarena had hired Captain Alfredo Zavala, a former Mexican military pilot, to fly to Zacatecas to see the marijuana fields in person. And there they were. Back at the consulate, Camarena and Condor wrote a mass of telegrams about their find. According to Camarena's case file, his informants reported that Felipe Aparicio Nunez, the DFS director, and Galo Gutierrez, a federal police general, were not just taking money to turn a blind eye, but were investing in a looming marijuana growing venture. One informant claimed to have seen Aparicio Nunez personally pick up 50 million pesos from a transporter for Rafael Caro Quintero. Another informant recounted that Gutierrez was ready to welcome the narco to his territory and was willing to assist them in any way possible. Moreover, when Camarena and Knapp spoke to General Gutierrez about his relationship with the drug traffickers, he did not hesitate to tell the Americans, "They'll come and make you an offer." Knapp recalled the general saying, "We will enrich you or kill you, so it's better to be rich than dead." In late May, Walter White, deputy to the gullible Ed Heath at headquarters, informed Camarena and Kirkendall that the feds were aware of the Zacatecas plantations and were planning to raid them. From the telephone conversation, Kirkendall concluded that Heath, as usual, had informed Federal Judicial Police headquarters and his friend Ibarra. Shortly thereafter, the Federals, led by Commander Ibarra, invaded the plantations. 150 acres of marijuana fields and 20 tons of marijuana were seized. According to Mexican newspapers, Ibarra announced that 177 people had been arrested in the case. But, as usual, the arrests did not include any of the right names from the list. The raid made Mexican headlines, but Camarena was discouraged. 20 tons of marijuana was nothing compared to what he thought was in there. And worse, the Guadalajara cartel now knew who Kiki Camarena was and what he looked like. Having broken one rule against flying solo over plantations, Camarena had broken another again, going undercover. Tired of the Fed's constant pranks, Kiki went undercover to the Zacatecas plantation, looked around and asked an informant to introduce him to Rafa's buddy Manuel Chavez, who was later arrested but released a short time later. Chavez had seen Camarena with the feds at the time of his arrest and was likely the one who told Rafa who Kiki was. But Kiki was no longer unstoppable. He found new informants among the traders and farmers associated with the fields, and by midsummer 1984, DEA agents knew that Caro Quintero and his comrades were establishing other large plantations in the desert states of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Baja California. Rafa, meanwhile, did not limit himself in any way because of unwanted attention to his person from pesky Americans. He acquired dozens of ranches and villas throughout northern and central Mexico. He bought 25 acres of land in a wealthy suburb of Guadalajara for $4 million in cash. He erected a 5-foot cement wall around the perimeter of the property and laid the foundation for the construction of a luxurious residence. When this ostentatious mansion was being erected, everyone in Guadalajara could see that Rafael Caro Quintero was not a criminal. Criminals hid in holes, and Rafael Caro Quintero lived wherever he wanted. Still, that newspaper article about the raid with the seizure of 20 tons in Zacatecas had some effect, but it wasn't the activities of the DEA's Guadalajara division that caused it. It was the steady, almost exponential increase in marijuana seizures along the US border. Mexican marijuana and brown heroin were available throughout the American Southwest, and prices were low. This undeniable fact made the Mexican government's claims of massive crop eradication implausible. Flight logs of US spray helicopters compiled by the Mexican Attorney General's office showed that the helicopters flew only 25% of the time. For years, they had not been properly maintained. The spare parts depot was empty, and informants who worked in several DEA offices in Mexico reported that herbicides were diluted with water or dumped in the desert. Ed Heath began to promote the idea that Mexico's drug eradication program required DEA intervention after all. State Department officials in Washington also concluded that drastic action was necessary. Ambassador Gavin, on the other hand, who was concerned about Mexico's debt crisis and was trying to cool Mexico's relations with Nicaragua, was opposed to radical changes in Mexico's drug campaign. Eventually, it was agreed between the agencies that the embassy would ask the Mexican government to allow DEA surveillance agents to fly over poppy or marijuana fields that were to be sprayed so they could verify claims of crop eradication. Ed Heath called the project Operation Vanguard. At first glance, the Vanguard plan resembled Kiki Camarena's Operation Milagro, but Camarena advocated that DEA pilots fly in airplanes with flight control capabilities. In Heath's plan, on the other hand, the planes and pilots were Mexican, and the DEA agents were passengers with no flight control capabilities. When Camarena heard about the Mexican pilots, according to Kuykendall, he wanted nothing to do with the project. The planes took off on their maiden voyage around November 1st, 1984. The DEA agents took to the air confirmed the worst suspicions of agents in Guadalajara. More marijuana and opium was growing there than imagined. And in the fall of that same year, 1984, a gang war erupted on the streets of Guadalajara. Competing drug traffickers ambushed each other and the police on avenues and in cafes. For US agents, the course of events confirmed that the Mexican government was giving up any claim to control the narcos. Shaggy Wallace, replacing Butch Sears, who had left for Bolivia, arrived at the office of Guadalajara in September 1984. When he arrived for duty, Kuykendall and Kiki sat him down and advised him to never relax. Guadalajara is not America, where every bargirl knows, kill a cop and it gets hot. On October the 10th, Agent Roger Knapp's parked car was fired upon. Knapp was sure it was the work of Félix Gallardo. It was the very same car that Knapp had used to conduct surveillance on Gallardo's office a couple months earlier. At that time, he was forcibly removed from the car and questioned by El Padrino's bodyguards, who showed police credentials. Back at the beginning of the year, Félix Gallardo demonstrated that he was aware of the Padrino operation and the increased scrutiny of his bank accounts, and that he didn't like it. On March the 28th, the former commandant of the federal forces visited Camarena with a message from Gallardo. It was that the DEA agents would be wise to finally get behind Senor Felix, who was an honest businessman. They would have been better off going after Rafael Quintero. But the DEA only stepped up the investigation, and not only in Mexico, but throughout the Southwest. In June 1984, the DEA office in Guadalajara received a tip that led their fellow agents in Los Angeles to a motel room in Anaheim. Inside were $4 million worth of bills with traces of cocaine. Scraps of documents found in the room led to bank accounts in San Ysidro, Laredo, and El Paso that were controlled by Tomás Valdez Corral, Félix Gallardo's financier. In total, DEA agents managed to get hold of $13 million tied to Gallardo's organization. They had no illusions about what they had accomplished. What we have here is pocket change, and Agent Scott Adams of the DEA's El Paso office. In August, deputies of the Gila County, Arizona's Sheriff's Office seized 1,600 pounds of cocaine traced to Félix Gallardo's network. This amount of cocaine would have brought in $30 million or more in the Los Angeles wholesale market. The Drug Enforcement Administration had nothing to do with the seizure. A tired state cop and his wife were chopping firewood, saw an airplane landing, suspected something amiss, and contacted law enforcement. Félix Gallardo, however, seemed to blame the DEA. Roger Knapp heard rumors that the gringos were in big trouble, as well as anyone seen with them. When his car was fired upon, Knapp assumed that Félix Gallardo had coordinated the warning with high-ranking federal police officials in advance. First, uniformed police arrived on the scene almost immediately. It usually took them half an hour to arrive on a call. Commander Flores of the federal police also showed up. Knapp figured he was checking to make sure no one was hurt. After the police left, Knapp called Mexico City and reported the incident to Walter White, Heath's deputy. A short time later, White called back and said that headquarters wanted Knapp to return to the States as soon as possible. Knapp didn't want to leave at all. He had done a tremendous job of investigating Félix Gallardo's organization. It was finally starting to bear fruit. He had a feeling a breakthrough was imminent. White had another talk with headquarters and secured a suspension. But the next day, Nap learned that the Los Angeles Drug Enforcement Administration office had seized 200 kilograms of cocaine that appeared to be Gallardo's. The seizure came just hours after Nap's car was fired upon. "It's time to go," Nap told his wife. He had nothing to do with the seizure, but Félix Gallardo's goons didn't know that. 3 agents remained: Jaime Kuykendall, Kiki Camarena, and newcomer Shaggy. Ambassador Gavin visited Attorney General Sergio Garcia Ramirez and Interior Secretary Manuel Bartlett Diaz. He delivered the message that if any unpleasant incidents like Nap's happened to a DEA agent again, the US would consider this an extremely serious matter with very profound and very long-term consequences. Kuykendall was furious. He felt that the ambassador should have made a scandal, but he didn't, and it turns out they were short of unleashing the narco-traffickers by their actions. A threat could be made, and the agent would go home. "Something bad has to happen," Kuykendall said doomily. Kiki agreed with him in pessimistic predictions, but no one was going to leave them, especially since the Zalava pilot had recently told him about Rancho Bufalo, Rafael Quintero's main project. According to the rumors, it was some incredible investment project, for the sake of which several of the biggest authorities had joined forces, and not only from the drug trade. It was forbidden to fly over the field without the owner's permission, and to take care of it required a huge number of servants who came from all over, from Sinaloa, Sonora, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, and even Guatemala. Kiki and Kuykendall reported the find to headquarters, and it turned out that at least 3 DEA officers from different parts of Mexico had also heard about Buffalo. Heath relayed this information to the Mexican Attorney General's office. A few days later came the official response that the information was untrue. There was nothing in the desert. Then Heath pressed the Attorney General's office and the headquarters of the Federales. Finally, Mexican authorities agreed to assemble a raiding party. Late in the evening of November the 6th, representatives of the federal police, the Attorney General's office, and the army met with a group of DEA agents and planned the attack. Early the next morning, they would move the squads into the Chihuahua Desert. Commandant Aldana Ibarra would lead the assault force. At dawn, the raiders headed into the Chihuahua Desert. Near the village of Bufalo, Mexican and US law enforcement officers in helicopters saw irrigated fields, barracks, and drying sheds 30 to 50 feet wide and 300 to 400 feet long. It took the raiders 2 days to scout the area. The scale of the project was staggering. The Mexican government had confiscated and destroyed between 5 and 10,000 tons of high-quality sinsemilla. There were 5 crop sites and 25 to 30 drying facilities, most of which were the size of a soccer field. This takeover set a new world record. No one had ever seen so much marijuana in one place. The fields were irrigated with water pumped from deep wells. They were well fertilized and cultivated with the latest high-tech intensive farming techniques. There was far more marijuana at this location than could be grown in the fields, leading agents to conclude that the Chihuahua compound was a storage and processing center for marijuana grown throughout Mexico. A number of informants told the agents that the compound belonged to a syndicate created by Rafael Quintero. Quintero later confirmed that he owned the compound and complained that he had invested $20 million in it. DEA officials estimated that if marijuana were sold on the street, it would generate more than $2.5 billion. About 7,000 frightened farmers were found at the 3 sites. They were hired by offering the huge sum of 250 pesos a day, that is about $6, to work in the fields. The unfortunates lived in appalling conditions. Armed guards made sure they did not escape, and those who tried were taken out by machine guns. The workers were fed potatoes, sour tortillas, hard beans, and coffee. Some of them said that at about 1 a.m., about 5 hours before the government troops landed, their field supervisors received word of the approaching troops and ordered the workers to get out. But they could not go far. They had no transportation and very little food. Some of them wandered in the desert for 3 days without food or water before they were found. According to DEA agents, among those arrested were 5 men who were members of the federal police. State Department officials were skeptical of that claim, but leaking information about the raid to drug traffickers was out of the question. After all, it meant that there was at least one double agent at the highest levels of the Mexican government. The setup meeting for the raid concluded late in the evening of November 6. Many people were present: army officials, top officials of the Attorney General's office, and a number of intelligence commanders. According to testimony, the workers were told to disperse at 1 a.m. on November the 7th. The implications is that drug traffickers were notified of the planned event almost immediately after it was over. Also disturbing, according to the congressional report, was the fact that the gasoline trucks that were supposed to fuel the helicopters were sent to the wrong location. This mistake nearly caused the raid to be cancelled. The size of the compound in Chihuahua stumped US government statistics. In 1983, US analysts concluded that 12 to 15,000 tons of marijuana were consumed in the United States. Here, in one place, was at least a third of that amount. DEA headquarters, the State Department, and the embassy finally heard what Camarena and his comrades had been trying to convey since 1982. The plantation existed. The photos from it created a sensation. First, the horrific human drama of the workers, some of whom died of thirst, and second, it began to dawn on the government that intimidation and bribes, not secrecy, were the drug traffickers' main trump cards. Many bribes. Ed Heath was reaping the rewards for organizing the raids in Chihuahua. He should have been, but Kirkendall was upset that Camarena hadn't received the same honor for his early discovery of the Caro Quintero plantations in the desert states. He nominated Kiki for the award in March 1984, but months passed and the award was never presented. He would be presented it posthumously. And Kirkendall also realized that they would have to take a beating from the neighborhoods enraged by the heavy losses, simply because Caro Quintero knew they were the ones responsible for his previous losses in Zacatecas, San Luis Potosi, and Sonora. Kirkendall again requested diplomatic passports and reinforcements, but he received none of these. A little later, Félix Gallardo's cocaine operation suffered even greater losses at the hands of US law enforcement in a short time. On November the 17th, authorities in California seized $3.7 million in cash that was linked to Félix Gallardo's network. On November the 26th, a deputy sheriff in Mohave County, Arizona, happened upon a small airplane parked on a deserted runway and looked inside. The cargo hold was loaded with 700 boxes wrapped in red, white, and green foil for Christmas. The boxes contained about 1,500 pounds of cocaine. The plane was identified by informants as Félix Gallardo's plane. The discovery of the cocaine went almost unnoticed by the American press, but Kirkendall, Camarena, and Wallace became very tense. The seizures also caused Gallardo to lose $10 million worth of cocaine. They assumed he would send another warning, shoot up another car, or perhaps blow up the consulate. And they were right. Although all of these seizures took place without the Guadalajara's office being involved, the Sinaloans were very angry. According to testimony in court, Mata, Félix Gallardo, and Caro Quintero got together to decide what to do with these Americans. Court documents state, members of the organization, including Mata Ballesteros, met and discussed the Drug Enforcement Administration agent responsible for the seizures. The narcotics then held another meeting at which they offered to scare the agent when his identity was established. The identity was established fairly quickly, not least because of those very plantation photos, which of course had come to them from their buddies in the police. In January 1985, two investigators from the House of Foreign Affairs Committee traveled to Mexico. Kirkendall and Camarena hoped they could get through to them and the government would finally take some action, but investigators advised them to go to the press to report local corruption. No drastic action would be taken by the State Department because Mexico is strategically important. What is going to happen? Camarena said sadly. Does someone have to die for them to start doing something? And so it happened. On February the 7th, 1985, Kiki Camarena walked out of the US consulate in Guadalajara to have lunch with his wife. He was walking toward his pickup truck when 5 men pointed guns at him. Kiki put his hands behind his head and they put him in the car. His wife didn't wait for him and called the station. Around the same time, pilot Alfredo Zavala disappeared, who, according to witnesses, was similarly forced into the car by armed men. And, just as Kiki had predicted, his death had been the catalyst. On April the 12th, a press conference was held at which US Ambassador to Mexico John Gavin announced that Enrique Carmena Salazar, an American DEA agent, had been kidnapped in Guadalajara. He also publicly stated that suspicion fell on 75 major drug traffickers who ran 18 gangs in Mexico, and that Guadalajara was a center of operations for international drug trafficking. Rafa Quintero at the same time left Guadalajara for an unknown destination with the assistance of a high-ranking federal police officer. On February the 16th, a unilateral interdiction operation was launched on the US-Mexico border line by order of the American Union government, with thorough searches of people and vehicles on the Mexican side. The Mexican government became aware of the measure and considered it unfair. The operation lasted until February 25th, but Kiki was nowhere to be found. Thus began a bitter confrontation between the two governments. The United States wanted the kidnapping of their agent investigated, since US officials knew of the corruption of many Mexican authorities and feared that the act would go unpunished. The Mexicans, of course, assured that Mexico was not a springboard for international drug trafficking and denied that their law enforcement officials had ties to the drug mafia, and then took a defensive stance, pressing the fact that all these years their drug eradication policies had produced the recognized results that had so pleased US policymakers. However, the names of the biggest drug traffickers were still announced on the Mexican side. Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, a Honduran, the Mexicans Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Juan Jose Esparragosa Moreno, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. On March 7, a month later, the bodies of Camarena and Zavala were found on a ranch in the state of Michoacan, owned by a former local deputy. Kiki had lived for 2 more days after the kidnapping and was likely buried elsewhere before being planted on the ranch where a group of people had previously been shot. His hands and feet were bound. There was not a single uninjured spot on his body, and a stick had been thrusted into his rectum. The cause of death was blunt force trauma that fractured his skull. The gruesome murder of Kiki Camarena was the last straw of the United States patience, and they were ready to use all means to ensure that the murder of their agent would not go unpunished. Pressure would be brought to bear on the Mexican government to take action against the immediate perpetrators of the murder, the drug trafficking leaders, and the police and political network that protected them. And the long search for a scapegoat began, with the most unexpected consequences. First, Ed Heath's former buddy, Aldano Ibarra, was fired for personal reasons that were not disclosed. Then the general who had helped Caro Quintero escape came under criminal investigation, and he was placed by Florencio Ventura, a man of crystal integrity who had once apprehended the Cecilia Falcone, was one of the few people who were trusted by the Americans. The state was gradually turning against drug traffickers. Rafael Caro Quintero fled Mexico with the complicity of federal judicial police officers on March 12, 5 days after Camarena and Zavala's body turned up. He traveled to Costa Rica with his girlfriend Sarah Cosio, the niece of an important Jalisco politician, Guillermo Cosio Vidori, who would later become governor of the state. With the help of Mata Ballesteros, Rafa settled in this Central American country, but the pleasure did not last long. He was hunted by the entire DEA, and Sarah was the reason they found him. She called her parents to inform them that she was with Rafa willingly. The call, of course, was immediately intercepted. On April 4, 1985, he was apprehended by Costa Rican police and Commander Florencio Ventura. As a result of the scandal, the Mexican press began to publicize Caro Quintero's activities and wealth. He was described as head of an army of armed drug traffickers estimated at 1,000 men, owner of 36 houses in Guadalajara and other property in Zacatecas, Sinaloa, and Sonora, owner or shareholder of 300 companies in Guadalajara. The fortune is estimated at 100 billion pesos. Rafa himself said that at the age of 28, he began his career as a drug trafficker, growing marijuana on small plots in Badiraguato, then moved to Guadalajara before moving the business to Chihuahua. He asked to be tried only as a drug trafficker, not a murderer. My first problem with the law happened when I was born. I always worked in the mountains where there was no law, he said. Even Caro's personal life became public. He reportedly kidnapped 17-year-old Sarah Cosio, whom he was trying to court, and forcibly took her to Costa Rica. He denied that it was a kidnapping and assured that her parents were aware of it and he even gave them all a car each. Rumor has it that he was tortured for this and forced to recant his words to the Cosio family. On December 12, 1989, he was sentenced to 92 years in prison for the murder of Kiki Camarena and several other crimes whose involvement was proven through Kiki's investigation. In 2013, due to procedural inconsistencies, Rafa was released from prison and disappeared, ending up on Interpol's most wanted list. A $200 million reward was set for his capture. On the run, Rafa would give 2 interviews to journalists in 2016 and 2018, denying that he had anything to do with the modern-day Sinaloa cartel and gang warfare and saying he only wanted peace. In the nearly 9 years he has been at large, however, Rafa Quintero has been glowing in his historic homeland and has figured in bitter disputes for control of various territories in Sonora, Sinaloa, and Baja California against the Los Chapitos group, son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On July 15, 2022, he is epically captured again and sent to Altiplano, from where the US is currently trying to extradite him to its territory. A few days later, in 1985, the government dealt another precise blow in Guadalajara's managerial structure. In Puerto Vallarta, Don Neto was arrested in a house owned by Ameca Candelario Ramos, director of the municipal police. He claimed that it was Rafa who kidnapped Camarena to reach an agreement with him, that he watched the agent die as he was beaten by Rafa and 2 of his assistants, that he became angry when he saw Camarena's breathless body and slapped Rafa. Don Neto was sentenced to 40 years and was released on house arrest in 2016 for health reasons. He is now 93 years old. The cunning Mata Ballesteros was imprisoned until 1988 in Honduras, which did not extradite criminals. On April 5, 1988, he was illegally removed from his home in Tegucigalpa and flown to the United States in 24 hours. This caused unrest in his homeland, and for a time the authorities even had to impose martial law. In the US judicial system, he went through all the circles of hell. He was offered a deal to surrender the president of Panama, but he did not agree. The judges recognized that Mata had been illegally removed from his homeland, but they said it had absolutely no effect on the trial. Mata's case is now cited as a precedent justifying the kidnapping of suspects from abroad. The charges against him relied on the testimony of dubious witnesses who took a plea bargain. He was put in the worst prison in the US, and his case was used to intimidate drug traffickers. If you don't make a deal, the judges said, you will end up like Mata Ballesteros. Perhaps it is also because he cooperated with the CIA, and in March 1988, the Contras and the Sandinistas signed a truce, which means that the services of the transporter and cocaine money were no longer needed by the CIA, which is why he was liquidated. The CIA trace is also traced to the case of Kiki Camarena, in which not everything is so unambiguous. There is a version that during the investigation, a DEA agent discovered something he should not have known. The CIA sponsors and Contras with cocaine money, and there is a training camp in Caboca under the full authority of Rafa Quintero, which is also sponsored by him, but with the full knowledge and unconditional patronage of the CIA. In this sense, the DEA and the CIA were competing organizations and their interests were opposing. In 2013, an investigation into the CIA's CIA trial in Kiki's murder was made public. 2 informants who were present at those events independently identified CIA agent Felix Rodriguez, also known as Felix the Cat, Lazarus, Felix Ramos Medina, and Max Gomez. It is likely that the recording of Camarena's professional torture was made by him. The character is notable in every way, almost cult-like. Rodriguez appeared in all CIA operations in South America, and in 1967, undercover as a major in the Bolivian army, he participated in the capture and interrogation of Che Guevara. And then it was he who ordered the execution. In the documentary The Last Narc, Don Neto's guards, former DEA agents, Kiki's widow, and many others involved in the case give testimony that adds up to the coherent picture. Rodriguez was directly involved in Kiki's torture and asked questions related to Guadalajara's activities. the final goal of which was to sponsor the Nicaraguan Contras. Rancho Bufalo had nothing to do with it. In fact, the order to eliminate Kiki came from his superiors. Jack Lawn, former head of the DEA, and retired Special Agent Jack Taylor, who investigated the assassination, have stated that the CIA was certainly not involved in Camarena's death. Lawn also stated that this is a fairy tale unworthy of the people serving in the DEA. A CIA spokesman told the press, "It is ludicrous to even suggest that the CIA had anything to do with the murder of a US federal agent or orchestrated the escape of his killer." Anyway, 3 center plays of the Guadalajara cartel were taken into custody. It turns out that in building their drug empire, it wasn't enough to buy everyone's escape of US prosecution. Their visibility in the corruption zone played into the hands of the Americans. What had initially allowed them to remain invisible was now pushing them out of the system to protect themselves. On April 18, the Mexican Interior Ministry ordered a restructuring of the ranks of the Federal Security Administration to arrest and imprison all those members of the corporation who were associated with drug traffickers, smugglers, or any other criminals. Press sources said the announcements had triggered a wave of defections among members of the agency, and on August the 22nd, the federal police, as it was not left at all. It was restructured into the General Directorate of Investigations and National Security, which had no operational authority to counter drug trafficking. This left Guadalajara without its best friends in the government. However, the above actions were not enough for the US authorities, who wanted to put behind bars all those who, according to their own investigations, were involved in the Camarena murder. Still at large was one of the bosses, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, who was hiding out in Mazatlan, Sinaloa State, visiting Governor Antonio Toledo Coro. Some details from Gallardo's socially active life were also leaked to the press. He had his own bank in the state of Chihuahua. For example, at least until 1982, documents listed his last name. In January 1985, he opened an automobile business with his partner and godson. Facts have surfaced about his work as an agent of the State Judicial Police in Sinaloa and bodyguard for Sanchez Celis, and friendship with Toledo Coro. Miguel Angel is found not in his historic homeland where he was protected, but in Guadalajara 4 years after the murder of Kiki Camarena. When the protection provided by the federal police disappeared, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo received the protection of the ruling party through his old acquaintance police chief González Calderoni, and all indications were that the storm was subsiding. 2 years after Camarena's murder, Calderoni assured Gallardo that the Americans had no hard evidence against him and that they would continue to support him. Their friendship continued, and according to Gallardo, they met at least 5 more times, and in 1988, Carlos Salinas became president of Mexico and began a kind of restructuring. Salinas immediately set about not only economic reforms that would eventually lead Juarez and Tijuana into wars, but also recognizing the drug trade. When he took office, Mexico's undisputed godfather was, of course, Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. In April 1989, Gallardo came to meet Calderoni at a Guadalajara restaurant to talk business. Or maybe it was not so, because in different sources of information about the detention of El Padrino vary. Only one thing is clear: the order to detain Miguel Angel was given from above. In fact, that's what he was told. There was nothing we could do. The order came from Mexico City. Gallardo himself states in his prison diaries that he was severely beaten and his ribs were broken during the detention. But the humiliation didn't end there. The new anti-drug director appointed by Salinas, Javier Coelho Trejo, met Gallardo at the airport in Guadalajara and began threatening him immediately. "We don't have anything against you yet, but we're going to fuck you," he said. Gallardo claims he was tortured for the next 24 hours trying to get him to testify about his involvement in Camarena's death, but he never said anything. Several important people from his entourage were taken in with Gallardo, including his accountant, who detailed all of El Padrino's movable and immovable property. Everything will be confiscated from his family, and the furniture from his mother's house will be remembered even in his interview in 2022. All the valuable items, he said, were illegally taken by Coelho Trejo and nothing has ever returned to the Gallardo family. They were forced to live in a rented house, and his youngest son needed expensive surgery for which there was now no money. I don't know if El Padrino's tales are true, but the fact that the Mexican government could take down the country's biggest gangster without firing a shot is very telling. In 1989, drug traffickers still relied on the police, on their connections, but Salinas' order to arrest the boss of bosses suddenly showed who was in charge. This is how they established an effective model of the relationship between the state and organized crime eventually broke down. 4 years after the murder of Enrique Camarena, under constant pressure from the DEA, Miguel Ángel was still at large, indicating the duality of the state's attitude at the time. On the one hand, the hunt for drugs was being intensified by the new structures, and on the other hand, the state sought to restore the old friendship that had been so badly interrupted by Camarena's murder, especially figures like Calderoni. State against state, but the arrival of Salinas and his turn toward the United States changed everything. A new era of cooperation with the White House had begun, and in this context, the capture of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was a powerful sign of the strengthening of the current government in the face of criminal organizations and police authorities. It was a clear signal of who is in charge of the country, and at the same time a positive nod to the US government for its willingness to cooperate in the fight against drugs. At the same time, Gallardo's arrest set in motion irreversible processes, as Valdez Castellanos called them, fragmentation and violence. After the arrest of El Padrino, the Mexican capos held a gangster summit in the resort of Acapulco. According to the authoritative sources, it was not Miguel Ángel himself who gathered the bosses, as in the TV series, anticipating the fall of the empire, but they gathered to decide what to do. El Padrino himself states in his diaries that Calderoni assembled the gathering. It is possible that both versions are true, because Calderoni was then confident in the imminent release of Gallardo. Old buddies from Sinaloa gathered in a luxurious chalet by the sea and decided how they would build a business. They were all related to each other, as relatives, as friends, as neighbors, as long-time business partners who had done hundreds of deals. All of them would play a crucial role in shaping the drug trade over the next 2 decades. Each capo was given an area where he could transport his own drugs and tax any other smugglers in his territory. Tecate for Chapo Guzman, Ciudad Juarez, and Nuevo Laredo for Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, a former federal police agent. San Luis Rio Colorado for Luis Hector El Güero Palma Salazar. Nogales and Hermosillo for Emilio Quintero Payan. Tijuana for Jesus Donchoy El Labra and his nephews, the Arellano Felix brothers. Sinaloa for Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Mexicali for Rafael Chao, another former federal. In addition, Manuel Beltran Felix, Rigoberto Campos, and Javier Caro Payan, Rafa's brother, could move freely throughout the plazas without causing trouble and acting only as liaisons. It all sounded like a good idea, but without the leadership of imprisoned godfather Félix Gallardo, the capos began feuding to get bigger pieces of the pie. As famed researcher Blancornelas wrote, "Never in the history of the Mexican drug business has there been another man like Félix Gallardo. He was a man of his word. He prioritized deals over shots, persuasions over execution. If the capos had followed his instructions, there would now be the most powerful cartel in the world. But the absence of a leader and the presence of several bosses, each feeling superior to the other, caused disorganization. In this confusion, 3 cartels, Tijuana with the Arellano Felix brothers, Juarez with Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and Golfo with Nepomuceno Guerra, came to power a little later. They were all Sinaloans and moved around the Sinaloan Empire, discounting shipments and sharing contacts with corrupt police officers. It is crucial to understand the connections within the Sinaloan realm to make sense of the current Mexican drug war. DEA agents also confirmed cooperation between all the narcos in northwestern Mexico. A classified operational intelligence report back in the 1990s made the following observations about this system. The cartel scheme is widespread but distorts the real power and strength of Mexican drug traffickers. Recent examples of people able to transcend these cartel boundaries include Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who collaborated with both El Chapo in Sonora and El Mayo in Tijuana. Although the Sinaloan clan still worked together, it was turbulent. The biggest skirmish in the early 90s broke out between the Arellano Felix brothers and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman over supplies in California. The war wasn't as brutal as the 21st century's near-professional squads fighting, but the thugs clashed in a series of shootings and murders, leaving dozens of bodies behind. In retrospect, these were the first signs that the Mexican government would prove unable to contain the beast of El Narco, that the bloodshed would spiral out of control. As professional historians say, it is always dangerous to read history backwards. At the time, no one in the Mexican government seemed worried. There is violence, but it's drug traffickers killing drug traffickers, politicians sighed. In any case, the drug traffickers were not attacking the system, but rather competing with each other to see who would be the best. The government could just watch the carnage and get paid, whoever was the winner. The 80s were thus without a doubt the decisive decade in the formation of organized drug trafficking crime in Mexico. First, the impact of the US drug market on the Mexican market was heterogeneous. Demand for marijuana and heroin plummeted, and Operation Condor put Colombians at the forefront of the pot market. On the other hand, it was the operation that catalyzed more massive cultivation in Mexican territories and also formed the corridor for cocaine transportation between Mexico and Colombia. Second, it was a golden decade for the Sinaloa organization. Under the leadership of Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Quintero, and with the support of family clans such as Guzman, Zambada, Arellano Felix, Carrillo Fuentes, Beltran Leyva, Lupercio, and alliances with political and regional heads, the Guadalajara cartel consolidated its power throughout the western territory of the country, Oaxaca and Baja California, along the entire Pacific coast, as well as Durango and Chihuahua. Only a few organizations competed with him, such as Pablo Acosta's organization in Ojinaga, although, as you may recall, the Sinaloan guarantor Amado Carrillo Fuentes came to him to deal with cocaine issues, and he ceased to be a competitor. Third, the model of coexistence between the state and drug traffickers jointly regulating drug trafficking by the 1980s had worn itself out and over time revealed fatal consequences: the expansion and intensification of organized crime and the transformation of police agencies into criminal ones, and consequently, the weakening of the state and the defenselessness of citizens. Fourth, the imprisonment of the main leaders of the Sinaloa organization, Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, led to fragmentation in several locations that would later be merged into family organizations. The disappearance of the dominant company facilitated the entry of new organizations into the illicit drug market. In short, from the quasi-monopoly of Sinaloa, the Mexican market moved to open competition and inevitably to a war between everyone for the biggest piece of the pie. The 90s were coming, new drugs, new players, and new rules. But that's a topic for the next video.